Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 8, in which we look at Fred's alibi. Now, Fred's alibi is referred to as rock solid, watertight, ironclad, whatever adjective you prefer. So what exactly is this kind of alibi? Well, I can tell you that it's an alibi that does not require you to pay millions of rands to defend yourself. It's not an alibi that requires of you to sell your farm in order to pay your legal bills. And it's an alibi that does not require you to go through a grueling 9-month-long trial at the expense of your health and sanity. The defense did not win the case because they provided a rock-solid alibi. As you will later see, even a judge had his doubts about the alibi. Now, while the state had to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt, all that the defense had to do was to show that Fred's alibi was reasonably possibly true. And reasonably possibly true is not the same as rock solid. And this is what the judge said in his judgment. In light of all these considerations, the court finds that the accused alibi is reasonably possibly true, and that the state could not succeed in proving his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The court finds him innocent and dismisses him. Now, the defense was successful because the trio of Wertheim, Zelenberg, and Dixon managed to convince the court through dubious and dishonest means that Volume 1 with Fred's fingerprint on was not taken from a DVD holder, but from a drinking glass instead. Now, in the previous 2 episodes, I've shown you all the tricks that Pat Wertheim came up to in order to trick the court into believing that Volume 1 came from a drinking glass. And if you want to see what Roger Dixon came up with, please read my blog post on my website, truthforinge.com. Now, remember what the judge said, that if Volume 1 was from a DVD holder, it would have destroyed his alibi. Well, I have shown that Volume 1 is not from a drinking glass, and that there is no reason to believe that it was not from a DVD holder. There is no evidence of a police mistake, no evidence of willful fabrication of evidence by the police. Volume 1 is legit. It is what it is. Proof that Fred was with Inge after 3:07 that afternoon. Now, Fred's alibi is that he was at work between 11:08 and 18:05, and that for most of the time that he was in a workshop with about 10 other people, and that he did not leave the meeting for long periods of time, except for lunchtime. Now, when the meeting ended at about 5 o'clock, he returned to the office where he logged onto his computer at 14 minutes past 5 to send a few emails. And then he said he logged off, spent some time in the office before leaving at 6:05 to return to his flat. Now, in support of his alibi, he presented CCTV footage and turnstile records to show that he entered at the PFS station entrance at 11:08 and 18:05. This was accepted and is not disputed. And here we can see the turnstile records confirming his arrival and departure at these times. And here we have the CCTV footage of him arriving, and of him leaving. Now, ladies and gentlemen, at this point it is important to remember that these 2 clips that you've just seen are the only footage of Fred that day. There are no other videos of him in a meeting or anywhere else in the building between these 2 times. I know there are many of you that think that there is CCTV footage of Fred sitting in a meeting all day. That is simply not true. And if that's what you believe, you've been lied to. Now, Fred also claimed that his phone and computer records support his alibi. Now, this shows his cell phone and computer activity after lunchtime that day, the 16th. And as you can see, all activity on his phone between his arrival and departure were registered to the cell tower in the vicinity of Old Mutual. At 2:13, while in a meeting, he got an SMS message, and the number of the sender is not known, nor the content of the message. Then also while in the meeting, Fred got a call from Jean Menard, most likely to talk about the small cupboard which Fred picked up for him earlier that day. Fred did not answer this call, and it went over to voicemail. Immediately after his voicemail, Fred got an SMS message notification that there's a voicemail for him. Then, at the beginning of afternoon tea time, at about 3:30, Fred dialed 121 to retrieve the phone message, and he listened to all of it. Then, at 4:21, his phone again received a text message from an unknown number, unknown content. And then Fred logged onto his work computer at 14 minutes past 5. Now, when looking at these records, we should only consider the activities that were initiated by Fred, like making a phone call, sending a text message, logging onto a computer. Records for incoming activities such as, for example, a voicemail or an incoming text message cannot be used to support an alibi, because these can be delivered or received without the phone having to be in the presence of its owner. Now, the only person-initiated activities were the voicemail retrieval at 15:29 and a computer logon at 14 past 5. In other words, there was a period of about 105 minutes where there was no phone or computer activity that was initiated by Fred and would therefore provide evidence that he was within Old Mutual for that period of time. And throughout the video, I will refer to this 105-minute period as the window period. Then Fred claims that his alibi is also supported by the fact that there are no CCTV footage or tensile records of him leaving the building between his arrival in the morning and his departure in the afternoon. Now, many would consider this to be a rock-solid alibi, and it would be if it was absolutely impossible to exit the building undetected. But was it really impossible? Thomas and I were personally told by people very close to the case that the state had the witness lined up to testify about the secret route out of Old Mutual, often used by staff to get out to go and watch sports events like cricket at Newlands. That it was possible to escape unnoticed was also recently confirmed by a News 24 podcast produced by Matthew Brown, and we know that he's very pro-Fred. Just listen.
We asked around, and rumour has it that you could actually sneak out a back door undetected. Staff members apparently used this when a big rugby or cricket match was on in Cape Town.
Now, even if such a back door doesn't or didn't exist, the security manager, Herman Lowe, indicated that security wasn't perfect at Old Mutual, and that with the right planning, it would not have been impossible to bypass security. He mentioned that Old Mutual had 14 entrances, gates, and delivery doors, and that CCTV footage for only 10 of them were reviewed for the 16th for a period between 3 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. This was done by Herman Lowe himself, assisted by 7 police officers over a weekend, and that would be about 31 hours of watching per person. Now, Fred wasn't observed, nor did they observe anyone behaving suspiciously, like jumping over turnstiles or crawling underneath turnstiles. He also said that at 4 entrances, video footage were not available because they were automatically deleted after 3 months. And also that the footage at some cameras were of bad quality, mostly due to the glare of the sun that made it difficult to impossible to identify people. So when swiping your security card at the turnstile, an image stored in the database appears on a visual identification monitor, so that security staff can visually verify that the card was used by the valid card holder. However, at the West Peak entrance, there were no security staff and no visual identification monitors. So if someone used someone else's security card, no one would know. The West Peak was also one of the entrances where the glare of the sun made it difficult to identify a person entering or exiting. So interestingly, if we look at the turnstile records for Monday the 14th, during his lunch break, Fred left through the West Peak entrance and he returned 40 minutes later. I don't know what he was doing there during that time, and I'm not necessarily saying this is suspicious and that he was doing a test run, but as a minimum, we know that he was familiar with the security setup at this entrance. Now, it is true that Fred could not have had the foresight to know about the sun glare problems and that video footage would not be available at some entrances. But perhaps we need to consider that Fred would not have anticipated that he would be investigated to the extent that he was. If it wasn't for the fingerprint on a DVD holder, which left there by mistake, the police would never have had enough evidence or grounds to obtain search warrants for his vehicle, for his flat, for his office, that led to the discovery of other incriminating evidence such as the hammer, the shoes, and the letter. He volunteered an alibi right during his first interview, and like a pro poker player, he bluffed, and the police just folded. So while Fred did the best to mitigate them, he would have had to be willing to take and accept some risk. If he didn't use the backdoor route, in my mind, it's not inconceivable that Fred, with some planning and some luck, could have exited through the West Peak entrance without being detected. This is what the judge said in response to the testimony by Herman Lowe. Here's something interesting that happened. Sometime after Herman Lowe reviewed the CCTV footage, he was approached by Fred, who asked him if they found anything on the CCTV footage. I leave that with you to draw your own conclusions. Now, with the very solid and incriminating fingerprint evidence, the police weren't particularly interested in Fred's supposed alibi. And by May 28, 2005, the police still had not taken any witness statements to corroborate Fred's alibi. So now the Van der Vyvers retained a private security firm called Cumic South Limited to obtain sworn statements from several of Fred's colleagues. So during the first 2 weeks of June, and this is now almost 3 months after the murder, and quite some time after Fred became a suspect, Cumic South obtained 14 witness statements altogether, of which 9 were from Mitchell Park staff who were either in a gap session with Fred or supposedly saw Fred in his office on March the 16th. Now I have an exercise for you. Can you think of a meeting or an event that you attended about 3 months ago? Not too big or too small, about 10 people. Can you remember who all attended the meeting? Who arrived late and at what time? Who left early and at what time? Can you remember the person that sat next to you? Or can you remember if anyone used a cell phone during the meeting? Now, I know some of you would say that the next day when they all found out about Fred's girlfriend being murdered the previous day, they would have committed Fred's movements to memory and would therefore still remember that 3 months later. Why would they do that? It's not as if Fred was accused of the murder. It's not like the headlines on the morning of the 17th blared out as Fred Van der Vyver killed his girlfriend the previous afternoon. Then yes, I would understand that the colleagues would then have thought about these movements on that day and remember them. But that's not what happened. And in none of the statements did the witnesses say when they found out about the murder of Inge. Interestingly, Janine von Stein, who was the facilitator of the meeting, who was front and center and interacted with everyone, told an associate of ours that she did not find out the next day. She only found out a couple of days later. So it doesn't seem like this was a topic that was discussed on the 17th. So before we start looking at some of these statements and what was said, I just wanted to make you aware that the session on Wednesday was not a standalone meeting. It was the fourth day of a 6-day workshop that started the previous Friday, the 11th, and pretty much the same people in attendance day after day discussing the same type of topics. So I imagine that it could therefore be difficult to separate and untangle one's memories from one day to the next, especially 3 months later. Now, Fred took a prominent role on the 15th, the Tuesday, when he did the presentation. So naturally, any memories about Fred and the workshop may be drawn to this specific day, because this was the day that he did something memorable. Keep that in mind, because you'll see that at least 2 witnesses got themselves confused between the 15th and the 16th. Now, the affidavits were not taken by an independent party with no skin in the game. They were hired by Louis van der Vyver, who wanted to establish his son's alibi. He had expectations, and this could obviously have influenced how Cumic asked their questions and how they wrote up the statements. It is clear that they had interviews with the different witnesses, and then they themselves prepared the statements, picking out what they think is important and then presenting it to each witness for signature. Well, most witnesses will just sign as long as nothing was an outright lie. But that does not mean that everything that was said made it to the statement and everything in the statement was said. It should also be noted that once these affidavits were given to the police, Director Torp questioned some of the witnesses and they withdrew their affidavits. So this is from one of the witness statements. Now, amazingly, this witness can't remember when Fred arrived, but remembers 3 months later that on that particular day, Fred did not seem restless or stressed. So recently, I dropped my daughter off at a friend's house for a play date. When I arrived there was a pickup truck parked in front of the house, and a man was busy loading building materials and tools onto the back of it. He must have been a handyman. When I was driving home, I thought to myself, and I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about memories and how long can you retain a memory, etc., etc. And then I thought to myself, if the police were to ask me now what I could remember about the person I saw 10 minutes ago, I would not be able to tell them anything other than he had dark hair, that he had a pickup truck with building materials. I could not tell them what it looked like. I would not be able to tell them the type of truck. I could not tell them the color of the truck. I could not tell them what he was wearing, whether he was tall or short. He was not behaving suspiciously. His behavior was normal. He was no threat to me. There was no reason why I should commit anything about him to memory. And for the same reason, why would these witnesses have had the need to commit anything about Fred's demeanor on the 16th to memory and to retain it for 3 months? Now, this witness was not in the meeting. He only noticed Fred during the day and that he saw Fred in the meeting. He does not say that he saw Fred there during the window period. Now, this person was also not in the meeting, and he saw Fred several times through the open door. And somehow, he also has an amazing memory in that he could remember from the few glimpses 3 months later that Fred appeared normal on this particular day. Was the 16th the only day that the door was open? Did he not see Fred through the door on the other days? How do we know that what he recalled was particular to the 16th and could not have occurred on any of the other days? Why this concern of Fred's demeanor? I think what Cumic wanted to show was that the argument between Inge and Fred that morning did not have an emotional impact on him, and that he therefore lacked incentive and anger to commit such a brutal murder. Here again, we have somebody that was not in the meeting and went home even before the meeting finished. And the fact that he might have seen Fred during the lunch break is no alibi at all, as the contention is that Fred left for Stellenbosch just after 3:30 p.m. Now, Janine von Stein was the facilitator of the workshop, and at the time she was in contract with Old Mutual as a business analyst. And throughout the meeting, she took notes. And after consulting her notes, she confirmed that Fred's presentation was on the 15th. And although she could remember Fred arriving at about 11 p.m. or 11 a.m., she could not remember his presence or absence for the rest of the day, as he did not have an important role in the proceedings of the 16th. Now, Musekeli Mabombo, he was a senior manager in Old Mutual, and he seemed to be one of the people that could not separate their memories from one day to the next, and stated that Fred also did his presentation on the 16th. He testified as an alibi witness, and as a result of the confusion about the dates, the court considered him an unreliable witness. Now, the vet Van der Spey shared an office with Fred, and if you remember from a previous episode, he was the one that received an email from Jaco Ghost that morning, on the morning of the 17th, asking him to give Marius Botha a call because the police were interested in Fred's movements on the 16th. Now, in court, the vet said that he saw Fred and had a conversation with him from just after 5 to about 6 o'clock. So all that the vet can testify to is that he saw Fred sometime after 5 o'clock. And nobody disputes that. We know that Fred logged onto a workstation at 14 past 5. But notice the gradual progression in Fred's favor. In his affidavit, the vet said that Fred was at his desk from about 5:15. Then in court, the vet said just after 5, and then the judge said 5 o'clock. So that is why the judge spoke of the window period as only an hour and a half long, but it was actually an hour and 45 minutes. And 15 minutes can make a big difference. So therefore, the vet cannot be considered to be an alibi witness. And I personally think the only reason why he was called as a witness was to tell the court that Fred did not appear tense, that he was just normal and at ease, which would obviously be inconsistent with someone who just committed such a brutal murder. And there is absolutely no scientific basis for this. Plenty of killers have lived normal lives, have committed atrocious crimes, and they will go home to their wives, girlfriends, and children as if nothing happened. And it seems that the judge attached quite a bit of weight to this 3-month-old memory by a person that is not qualified to reliably assess a person's state of mind from body language and outward appearances. Now, Shahana Tuffy. This is from her witness statement. So yes, let's look at some of the interaction between Shahana and Fred prior to her making this statement or this affidavit. Remember that Fred called her about half an hour after he found out about Inge's death, supposedly to tell her he won't be at work the next day. Then half an hour later, she called him back, and the reason for this call has never been revealed. Then on Friday the 18th, after a series of phone calls, backwards and forwards, Fred met with Shahana, likely in the lobby of Old Mutual, only for a few minutes. What was so important that they had to meet in person? What was collected or what was dropped off? Then in one of his statements, Marius Botha stated that one day during the 3rd week of April, he saw Fred and his parents having lunch with Shahana Tuffy and 2 other managers in the Barney Cafe inside Old Mutual. So there had been contact between Fred and Shahana prior to the statement, and we won't be wrong to refer to Shahana as a potentially contaminated witness. Now, if you look at Shahana's statement, she could not even recall all the participants in the meeting, most noticeably her boss, Musekeli Mubombo. And we know that Fred did not give presentations all week, only on the 15th. And here, Shahana thought that Fred gave the presentation on the 16th. She made the same mistake as Mubombo. The director Trollop testified about his interactions with Shahana Tuffy. This is what he said. It's difficult to say whether it was a result of antagonism or fear. She was not a pleasant person to speak to. She was not helpful. The best indication I can give is that at the end of the conversation, I suggested to her that if we needed to talk to her again, perhaps she should get some kind of assistance, even if it is just a legal advisor to support her. So I wasn't comfortable in her presence, and I didn't think she was terribly helpful. In addition, later Trollop pointed out that Tuffy refused to sign a formal notice that she received that she was going to be a state witness. And Trollop also found it suspicious that Tuffy did not mention in her statements, nor to him, the fact that Fred called her that evening about half an hour after Inge's death. He sensed that she was trying to hide the cooperation that took place between her and Fred. Now, it is true that Tuffy might have felt intimidated by Trollop and his style of questioning and investigating, which as a police officer seeking the truth, he had every right to do, given the fact that Fred's fingerprints on the DVD holder means that Tuffy was not honest about his statements. Now, Tuffy was supposed to testify directly after Mubombo, but at the last minute and quite unexpectedly, the defense decided not to call their star alibi witness. So earlier during the cross-examination of Mubombo, the state made mention of Tuffy's statement, and that gave the defense the opportunity to enter Tuffy's affidavit into evidence, to the court, without having to call her as a witness, and thereby denying the state through cross-examination to test Tuffy's version. And when a judge asked Advocate Dupe the Brain why they pulled her, he red-faced said, "We have our reasons," and the judge simply left it there. Could the reason be that the defense was scared that Tuffy may not stand up to cross-examination, that she may crack and spill the beans? We know that earlier that morning, prior to her having to testify, she was observed in a coffee shop near the courthouse, looking incredibly nervous. Her hands were shaking, there were tears in her eyes, and she was clearly afraid of something. Now, in his judgment, the judge said the following about Tuffy's statement. Now, we know that the judge considered Mubombo as an unreliable witness because of his confusion about on which day Fred did his presentation. But Shahana is guilty of the same, and yet the court did not consider her statement as unreliable. Judge Van Zyl had the right to call Shahana Tuffy as a witness, even if the defense did not want to. This is allowed in Section 186 of the Criminal Procedure Act. The court may at any stage of criminal proceedings subpoena or cause to be subpoenaed any person as a witness at such proceedings, and the court shall so subpoena a witness or so cause a witness to be subpoenaed if the evidence of such witness appears to the court essential to the just decision of the case. And Fred's alibi certainly was essential to this case. But to the court's credit, it did not think much of the alibi. During the defense closing arguments, the following exchange occurred between the judge and Advocate Dupe the Brain. So please bear with me. I know this is a lot of reading, a lot of text, but this is extremely important and very revealing as to what the judge thought of the alibi testimony presented up to this point. The judge said, "Evidence that may refute his alibi has been presented. It is then the accused who must present evidence for his alibi." The Brain said, "But the evidence for the alibi is before you." Then the judge, "It's not evidence, Mr. De Brain." "What is not evidence?" "All that we have before us is a broad plea explanation, but it is not evidence. It's just a plea explanation." Only when an accused himself says where he was at every moment of that day does it become evidence. A plea explanation is an accommodating document. It is not submitted to cross-examination. There are many questions that arise from his plea explanation which could have been asked if they were presented by means of testimony. So the question is, what is the evidence that we have for the alibi? We have evidence that refutes it. But do we have evidence about an alibi from about 3:30 that afternoon to 5:10? That is the evidence that must be tested under cross-examination, and that is what bothers us about the whole alibi. My Lord, with the greatest respect, it shouldn't bother you because there is more than just one plea explanation. But even if there was just a plea explanation, if the count set out in that plea explanation is reasonably possibly true, then the accused must get the benefit of that. But there's also a sworn statement from him that has been entered and that says that he was at Old Mutual the whole day. That is evidence. But that is not evidence yet. It's not evidence until he comes to the stand and says that it's indeed what happened. He attests to the contents of the statement. A statement is not evidence. It has not been tested through cross-examination. And that is the whole idea behind cross-examination, to test his account. Well, similarly, one can argue that Shahana Tuffy's affidavit was submitted and was attested on a cross-examination, so should therefore not have counted for anything. This compelled the defense to submit an application to reopen the case so that Fred could take the stand to testify about his alibi. And at the end, the judge accepted that Fred's alibi could be reasonably possibly true, and the rest is history. So throughout the affidavits taken by Cumic, there seems to be a preoccupation with Fred's cell phone. It seems that the investigators asked questions of the witnesses about Fred's cell phone and if they've seen him using it, and it seems they've also asked whether they've seen Fred with a second cell phone. Why was this so important to Fred's alibi? If Fred was in a meeting, as they claimed, of what importance is it that Fred had a cell phone and how many he had and whether they have seen him using it or not? In my opinion, they may have been concerned about these two text messages, the one that Fred received at 2:13 while he was in the meeting, and then at 4:20 right in the middle of the window period. Unfortunately, because Vodacom and MTN were unable to somehow record the sender's phone numbers, we don't know the phone numbers associated with these text messages, nor have the content thereof ever been revealed, to the best of my knowledge. I think they wanted to show that Fred did not and could not have texted himself at 2:13, which would then cast doubt also on the text message which Fred received at 4:20. And the reason for this will become clear soon. Now, Fred, being clever and an intelligent person, would not have taken his cell phone with him, because as soon as he received a call or an SMS message, the phone records would later show that the cell phone was not at Old Mutual and that this would be something that he had no control over. He could obviously have switched his phone off, but he would have wanted to use his phone to aid his alibi. So he could have decided to leave his phone at Old Mutual in case no one sends him a phone message or calls him during the period. He decided that he would send himself an SMS message from a spare phone right in the middle of the window period, so that there's a record that places his normal phone at Old Mutual. And the fact that so many people think that his phone record confirms his alibi shows that this was not a bad plan. In my opinion, the text message he received at 2:13 could have been a test run to see what an SMS message would look like on his normal phone. Now, it's possible that Fred had at least 1 to 3 spare phones lying around. If not, it would have been easy to buy a cheap phone somewhere. This was the days before RICA, so it was easy to buy a SIM card at the corner cafe without having to provide any personal information. Now, as you can see, that since October 2000, Fred's phone number was associated with 4 SIM cards, and they were used in a variety of phones. I don't know about you, but I still have in the drawer somewhere all the cell phones I've ever owned. So if Fred did commit the murder, he had to drive to the Shiraz complex and back and do everything else within that 105-minute window period. Fred argued that this was not long enough, and it seems that the judge agreed with him. But then again, the judge was the one that talked about an hour-and-a-half window period, whereas it was actually an hour and 45 minutes. According to Fred's plea explanation, it would take him between 77 and 80 minutes to drive to Shiraz and back, and about 10 to 12 minutes to walk from his office to his vehicle and back. So that would be a one-way trip of between 38.5 and 40 minutes. Now there are several routes he could have followed, all with approximate same travel times. Routes that included sections of the N1 and N2 would have afforded him the opportunity to drive at speeds of up to 150 kilometers an hour. Here you can see that more than 50% of the red route was on the N1, where I myself, to remind you, frequently drove with speeds up to 150 kilometers an hour. Now in the Huisgenootse ware levensdrama documentary about Inge Lotz on YouTube, some investigators did a drive test between Old Mitchell and Shiraz. And they did this on Wednesday, the 20th of September 2005, between 11:36 and 12:11. This one-way trip took them 35 minutes. So over the years, I've given a lot of thought about what transpired that day and what led up to the murder and how it could have happened, especially what could have happened during that 105-minute window period. And Thomas and I had many discussions about it. And I'm just going to give you a breakdown of what I think happened, using the objective evidence as a guide. Now, I will make a lot of assumptions, and as far as possible, I will be conservative in my assumptions, so that it favors Fred. I make no claim that everything I say will be 100% accurate. I make no claim that what I present to you is evidence. I admit that I will be speculating and that there are room for error in my analysis. But bear with me and see if what I say makes sense. So first of all, the question is, when would Fred have decided to do the deed on that particular day? Now, I personally suspect that is something he mulled over and perhaps rehearsed in his head for some time. But I'm going to assume that it was decided that morning after he stormed out of Inge's flat, because that is a more conservative approach. We also know that the previous evening, Fred must have taken a bag with him with a change of clothes and some toiletries, because he was going to stay over at Inge's place in order to be at the university the next morning. It's possible that he would have changed into casual clothes first and wearing his high-tech shoes, because those are shoes he apparently wore quite often. We also know that he kept in the back of his vehicle some sports equipment, and likely he had another bag in there with some other sports-related clothing, for example, tracksuit. So the next morning, as he dressed into more formal work clothes, his casual clothes and his high-tech shoes were placed back in the bag. And it would have been important for him to create the illusion that everything between him and Inge was just normal and fine, and that there was no animosity towards her. So he would have made sure that the text messages that were exchanged between them were loving and no different than the previous text messages that were exchanged. We have to remember that the easiest thing to write a text message to convey exactly the opposite of what you're feeling. You have time to think, you can revise and edit, and you don't have your body language and your tone of voice to betray you. And here's another thing. Just because Inge appeared fine after the argument, it does not mean that Fred felt the same way. Therefore, the loving tone of the text messages between Inge and Fred that day means absolutely nothing. It should have no evidentiary value, and the court should not, as it did, have factored it into its judgment. So after leaving Inge at the university, after Inge gave him the letter, he could have stopped somewhere to buy a SIM card. It could have been just before or after he picked up the small cupboard. He then placed the SIM card in a spare phone, which he either had in his vehicle or in his briefcase or even in his office. It could also be that in preparation for this day, he bought the SIM card and the phone sometime before. However it came to be, when he arrived at Old Mitchell, he very likely already had two phones with him, his normal cell phone and the second phone with a phone number nobody knows and that nobody could trace back to him. Then I think that when Fred arrived at Old Mitchell, he did not park close to the PFS station entrance where we saw him enter on the CCTV footage. He would have parked closer to the back door where he would have exited the building. He would then simply have walked up the ramp and across the deck to the PFS entrance. At this point, there was no rush. He was not expected to arrive at the meeting at a specific time. He was perhaps already ahead of time as the classes at university ended early that morning. Sometime before leaving the vehicle, all he had to do was to put the hammer in the bag, which he appeared to have kept in behind the seat of his vehicle. We know that in the back there were already the sports shoes and the casual clothes from the previous day. If these casual clothes were not the protective clothing he would wear during the murder, he could have transferred clothes from another sports bag into this bag. He probably would have needed a plastic bag in order to place the bloody clothes into. I'm pretty sure Inge had plastic bin liners somewhere in the flat, most likely under the kitchen sink cupboard, which Fred could have retrieved. Now then, during the meeting at 2:13, perhaps when he stepped out briefly to go to the washroom, Fred then tested his phone and sent himself a text message to his normal phone. And then during the meeting at 2:51, Fred received a phone call from John Minnar. And because he was in the meeting, he didn't answer the phone and he let it go to voicemail. Then at the beginning of the afternoon tea break, he stepped out, dialed 121, and listened to the 52-second long phone message. And that call ended at 15:30:41. As we all know, it's possible to walk while speaking on a cell phone. Therefore, we don't know where he was when the call ended. It's conceivable that the phone call was completed while he was well on his way out to the vehicle, and he could have hidden the phone somewhere, en route. A plastic bag hidden in a bush for a few hours, tucking behind a bin somewhere, just for a few hours, low risk of being found. But for the sake of this exercise, and to be conservative, we are going to assume that he was at his desk when he finished the call. So immediately after the call, he put the phone, which was already on silent mode, in a drawer of his desk, and then sneaked out by the back door we know existed and that was often used by staff to leave the building undetected. I don't know precisely where the back door is, but my best guess is it's likely on the west side here, somewhere close to the West Peak exit, where he exited and entered 2 days before. Now let's assume walking down from his office to his vehicle took him 6 minutes. Now I think this is very conservative, as I believe he would have attempted to park his vehicle close to the exit point. Time was going to be of the essence. So let's give him a minute to unlock his vehicle, to get into the vehicle, to buckle up, to back out, and to get going. And as he would have driven with a sense of urgency, we give him 35 minutes to drive to outside the gate of the Shiraz complex. As we know, 35 minutes was the travel time recorded by investigators when they did a time test on Wednesday, September the 20th, 2005. So he would have arrived at the Shiraz gate at about 4:12. He could have either called Inge on the intercom or opened the gate with a remote he had. He previously said that Inge had 3 remotes, but that he didn't know the whereabouts of the 3rd remote. To be conservative, we are going to assume that he wasn't lying when he said that he didn't know where the 3rd remote was, and that Inge therefore must have let him in. He likely would have parked in the visitor's lot on the far side, and then walked along the back of the building to the walkway, which is about halfway down, and then up the stairs to Inge's flat. So if we assume it would have taken Inge about 45 seconds to open the gate, and took Fred 30 seconds to park and 45 seconds to walk up to Inge's flat, he would have arrived at Inge's door at about 4:14. So Inge had plans that afternoon. She was going to relax with her magazine and a DVD until about 5 that afternoon before she gets back to her studies. I think therefore it's quite possible that after she opened the outside vehicle gate for Fred, she quickly opened the door and the gate and went back to the couch to continue reading the magazine. So when Fred arrived, the door and gate had already been opened so that he could let himself in. It's quite possible, therefore, that Inge, with her back to the door, didn't even see that Fred came in with a sports bag. And I'm sure Fred would have had an excuse ready for his unexpected visit and for him having the sports bag with him. They probably talked for a while as Fred explained what he was doing there, and it is likely during this time that Inge asked Fred to please put the DVD disc in the player. Now, this is not something that Fred expected nor planned for. And since it would have not been easy to refuse Inge's innocent request without appearing suspicious, and without time to fully think about the consequences, Fred picked up the DVD holder and put the disc in the player. He generally knew that his fingerprints in the flat would not be incriminating, as he has been there the previous evening and that morning, and in that moment he just did not think about the fact that Inge only took out the DVD at about 3 p.m. that afternoon. All he did was a mistake, and mistakes are made. Again, as time would have been of the essence, Fred would have wanted to keep the talking to a minimum, and in my opinion, a 2-minute time for talking while putting the DVD in is not unrealistic. Now, I think it's a mistake to assume that the heated argument must have preceded the assault, and that Fred could have lost his temper and attacked Inge in a violent rage, that it was not planned. Careful efforts to leave Old Mitchell undetected, bringing the hammer with him up to the flat, protecting his clothes from blood spatter, etc., are all indications that it was a planned attack. The violent overkill nature of the attack does not mean that it could not have been premeditated. Then I imagine he could have excused himself to go to the bathroom. Once there, very quickly, he could have kicked off his work shoes and put on some protective clothing over his work clothes. Perhaps a tracksuit pants and a hooded top, or even a disposable coverall like this. Cheap, easy to buy, easy to put on, and easy to dispose of. To save time, he likely would not have put his sports shoes or any shoes on, and he would have stayed in his socks. In a later video, I will show how the shoes could still have made the blood mark, even if they weren't on Fred's feet. This changing and putting on protective clothing could have all have been done in 1 minute. I did a test to see if a 1 minute assumption was realistic. I walked about 6 to 7 meters to my bedroom from my workstation, removed my shoes, opened a sports bag, pulled out the tracksuit pants, put it on, pulled out the tracksuit top, put it on, zipped it closed, and put a hoodie over my head, and returned to my workstation within 50 seconds. Then the attack on Inge, about 12 hammer blows, and fetching a knife from the kitchen and delivering about up to 50 stab wounds. Believe it me or not, this could have been done in less than 2 minutes, and that's a conservative estimate. I did the test to see if a 2-minute assumption was realistic. I hit an old pillow with a hammer about 12 times, walked 3 to 4 meters to the kitchen to fetch a wooden spoon from a drawer, and then I stabbed the pillow about 50 times and pretended to carve out an arrow. This took me 1 minute and 20 seconds. Then after attack, he possibly went up to the balcony curtains to peek out to ascertain whether any noises Inge made could possibly have alerted anyone, before turning to the bathroom, where he could have washed his hands and continued to use the towel to clean and dry the hammer. He would have removed the protective clothing or the coverall. He wrapped the knife in it and stuffed it in a plastic bag, which at some point he retrieved from the kitchen. This bag with clothing could have either been discarded in the garbage bin somewhere between Stellenbosch and Pinelands, or that evening between Pinelands and Welgemoot. Now in the next episode, I will talk about why I think he didn't throw away the hammer. And for the removal of clothes, cleaning up and packing up, I will assume a very conservative 6 minutes. All of this could have been done in about 3 to 4 minutes if you work with a great sense of urgency. Remember, time was of the essence. Then at about 6:21, sometime between the end of the attack and the end of his cleanup, he could have sent himself an SMS message from a spare phone to his usual phone, which, as we know, was at the time was in the vicinity of Old Mutual. As I mentioned before, he did this in order to create a record that would support his alibi. It's likely that after the cleanup, he would have gone quickly to Inge's bedroom, pushed the bed away from the wall so he could peek through the blinds in the window to see if the coast was clear. Then, without delay, he would have left the flat to return to his vehicle, and there's no reason why this peeking through the window should have taken him more than 1 minute. And if we allow 2 minutes for him to walk to his vehicle and to drive out of the complex, he would have left the Ras to drive back to Old Mutual at about 16:28. Remember, at that time you would have had Inge's remote with him, and there would have been no delay in opening the gate. The spare phone and the remote probably ended up in the same bag as the bloodied clothes and knife. To avoid the unwanted attention of traffic police, he probably would have driven slower and more carefully. Getting caught for speeding at that point would have been devastating, as it was not really an issue on his way to Shiraz, because if the police caught him at that time, he simply would have changed his plans for that day. So instead of the 35 minutes, we are going to assume a slower travel time of 38 minutes. So he would have arrived back at his parking spot at Old Mutual, likely close to the back door, at about 6 minutes past 5. That would have given him a whopping 8 minutes to get back to the 7th floor, where he logged onto a computer at 5:14. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a hypothetical scenario to show you at least of what could have been done within that 105 minutes. Many of you think that in order to do everything that he had to do, it could not have taken place in that 105 minutes. But it could have. We just have to be realistic about how long certain activities would have taken. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to bringing you the next video, which is about the hammer. The hammer, together with the fingerprint evidence, was an extremely incriminating piece of evidence, and you will see the length that the defense went to discredit the hammer evidence. So until next time, take care and thank you.